Welcome, dear horror writers, to another deep dive into the dark. Today we're exploring a subgenre that whispers from the woods, crawls through folklore, and thrives on fear of the old ways. So light your lanterns, step beyond the hedgerow, and stay close to me, and don't stray far from the path, because you might not like what you find in the woods, but you'll learn how to write it. This is folk horror. So to start off, what is folk horror? Folk horror is a horror subgenre that's rooted in ancestral memory, forgotten rites, and the primal fear of what lies just beyond the edges of civilization. It draws its power from the old ways, which consists of the myths, beliefs, and the rituals that once governed how people lived, worshipped, and died. This is a kind of horror that thrives on tradition, turns sinister, and the idea that the past isn't just lingering beneath the surface, but that it's alive and waiting to reclaim the present. So at its core, folk horror is about place. It's deeply tied to the land and to the people who serve it. The woods, the mountains, the soil beneath the forgotten village. All of these things carry history, and that history is rarely kind. Folk horror transforms the natural world into something sacred, sentient, and hostile. So unlike slashers or standard supernatural horror, folk horror isn't about putting your protagonist into immediate danger. It's supposed to be slow, psychological, and ritualistic. It works through atmosphere and unease, building dread one comfortable moment at a time. And while in other horror subgenres where the horror comes from the monster or the ghost, here the horror usually comes from the realization that something ancient has survived and it still holds power. And you're not in control, and you never were. As for its structure, folk horror usually places a modern outsider, aka your protagonist, who's usually rational, scientific, or deeply religious person, into an insular, isolated community that's governed by older laws and traditions. The horror rises from the clash between these two vastly different worldviews, where one is rooted in modernity, the other is rooted in tradition, and more often than not, it's the old ways that win. And with that being said, it leads us into what is usually referred to as the holy trinity of folk horror, which is the films The Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. These three British films are considered to be the films that founded the genre, which shaped its themes, iconography, and tone. In The Witchfinder General, we follow a corrupt witch hunter played by my fave Vincent Price, who is exploiting fear and superstition in 17th century England. It's a bleak look into how power, belief, and violence intertwine. Because here, there's no monster, just man, and man is more terrifying than anything supernatural. The horror lies in the abuse of religious authority and the unrelenting cruelty of mob justice. The Blood on Satan's Claw brings us into rural England, where unearthed remains awaken something ancient, which leads a group of village teens to begin behaving strangely, as if they've been possessed by a demonic force. This film is steeped in the idea that evil can seep from the land itself and that innocence can be corrupted through belief. It's a story of slow infection that's social, spiritual, and physical. And then there's The Wicker Man, which is arguably the most iconic of the three. It's about a devout Christian police officer who travels to a remote island to investigate a missing child. What he finds is a community that's long since abandoned Christianity in favor of pagan ritual. Here we see the horror unfold through music, politeness, and perfect design. It's the horror of knowing you're the only one who doesn't understand the rules of the game and that your role in the ritual has already been decided. Each of these films highlights a different facet of folk horror, but they all share the same essential components, which are isolation, landscape, and skewed belief systems. These three elements form what is known as the folk horror triangle, which is a structure that the subgenre uses to disorient, trap, and ultimately transform both your characters and your readers. So let's break them down and see how you can use each in your writing. First, let's start with isolation. In folk horror, isolation is the necessary first step towards transformation or destruction. Without isolation, this means that your protagonist can call for help. They can leave whenever they want to, and they can retain their identity and worldview. But once they're isolated, their familiar systems start to break down. This isolation can be physical. Like, think of a character who arrives in a remote village that's only accessible by a boat and only travels to the village once a week. Maybe there's a dense forest forest that blocks all roads, or maybe a storm washes out the only bridge, or the GPS suddenly fails and the signs no longer match the map. Here, what we're trying to do is create a sense that the character or the characters have passed a point of no return. But when we talk about isolation in folk horror, we have to go beyond the physical distance, because isolation isn't just about how far the village is from the nearest city or whether the roads are washed out. It's also social and cultural. Wherever your protagonist ends up, they won't understand the language, the customs, or the quiet rules that govern daily life. They'll be surrounded by smiling faces that speak politely to them, say everything that they want to hear so that the red flags don't start flying all over the place, and they'll offer kindness that feels just a little off. Even in the crowd of this village, your protagonist is completely and utterly alone. And that sense of exclusion isn't an accident, because while the community may seem warm and welcoming, but the outsider will never belong to them, because that distance that the community has created has been carefully constructed. The protagonist wasn't just passing through, they were brought here, lured, and chosen. And you can also explore psychological isolation. Maybe the character is grieving or mentally unraveling. Maybe no one believes them when they begin to suspect something is wrong. In folk horror, the protagonist is often gaslit not by one person, but rather by an entire system, and their inner self begins to fracture under the pressure of being the only one who sees the truth. The writing tip here is to slowly close the doors. Don't isolate the character all at once. Create moments where they try to leave but are stopped. Have the villagers distract them, offer hospitality, tell them they can stay for the festival, or cut off contact with the outside world. Let the isolation sneak up. Make the reader feel it tightening around the character like a noose. Next, we have the landscape. In folk horror, you want to remember that the natural world is never neutral. It's alive and it has intention, and it doesn't just contain the horror, it is a part of the horror because it carries memory, power, and usually vengeance. For example, in The Witch, the New England wilderness is unknowable, endless, and full of whispers. In The Ritual, the Scandinavian forest twists reality, trapping the characters in loops and pulling them towards something ancient. And in Midsummer, the sun never sets and the brightness becomes oppressive, blurring the line between ritual and reality. Your job as a writer is to make the reader feel that the land sees them and that it remembers something the protagonist doesn't. And you can do this through atmosphere. Describe how the trees seem to lean in when no one's watching. Let the air carry strange scents during specific times of the day. Give the landscape patterns, moods, and reactions. Does it reject certain people? Does it demand offerings? Is there a stone circle, a burial mound, or a field where the crops thrive a little too well? Nature in folk horror is sacred, but not necessarily benevolent. It's not evil in the way that a ghost might be, it simply follows its own rules, and those rules are older than any character's understanding. It might be indifferent to human suffering, or it might require it. So when you're writing your landscape, you want to treat it as a character, give it traits, behaviors, and a kind of ancient logic. Use weather and light to shape emotional tone. Maybe the fog rolls in during key transitions. Maybe a wind always rises before a ritual. Let the environment influence the story's rhythm, and the reader will begin to feel its presence long before anything supernatural happens. And lastly, we have skewed belief systems. This is the heart of folk horror because it's the system of thought that governs the isolated community. And it's not enough just to say that they're pagans or cultists. You need to fully build out their beliefs. What do they worship? What do they fear? What is sacred and what is taboo? Folk horror works best when the belief system is internally consistent. It may seem nonsensical to the outsider protagonist, but it must make perfect sense to the people who live by it. This creates cognitive dissonance. The protagonist is told they are wrong, sinful, cursed, or dangerous for not obeying these rules. And the more they resist, the more the community turns against them. The key here is that the belief system doesn't need to be malicious. It can be loving, peaceful, and logical within its own frame. And it's that makes it so disturbing. Like in Midsummer, the villagers do not see their rituals as violent or cruel. They see them as necessary, even beautiful. This disconnect between what the protagonist sees and what the community believes builds dread. So when you're creating your own belief system, ask yourself, what myths do these people tell their children? What holidays do they celebrate and why? What kinds of behavior are punished and what is rewarded? Who holds spiritual authority and what rituals bind the community together? The more detail you put into the belief system, the more immersive and terrifying your world becomes, and the more dangerous it becomes for the protagonist to challenge it. As a writing exercise, try writing a hymn or a folktale from the community's point of view. Even if it never appears in the final story, it will help you understand how they think, what they value, and how they justify their actions. Now, when you put isolation, landscape, and skewed belief systems together, you get the classical folk horror structure, which goes a little bit like this. The outsider arrives believing they're in control. Slowly, the land begins to shift around them. It disorients, unravels, and closes in. The people seem friendly. They sing, smile, and observe until the rituals begin to reveal deeper purpose. By the time the protagonist realizes something is wrong, they're already part of it. Resistance only tightens the grip of the community, and in the final act, the horror takes shape through transformation. Sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes physical, but it's always irreversible. This triangle traps the body, reshapes the mind, and once a character steps inside it, they never leave the same. In folk horror, the setting is central to everything because it carries weight, history, and atmosphere. The world you create should feel old and lived in, as though time has folded over it again and again. Every inch of soil, every stone wall, and every crooked path should suggest something deeper, something that existed long before your character ever arrived. When you choose a location, you want to choose one that breathes, like a fog-covered village at the edge of forgotten farmland, a forest marked by ancient stones and paths that never lead the same way twice, a crumbling coastal town where the tide pulls strange things from the sea. And these places should feel cut off, not only geographically, but spiritually. Technology fails, maps don't help, and the land rejects logic. Sensory detail is also important here because it grounds the reader in the space, so you want to absorb the damp scent of moss and decay in the air, the way shadows seem to move just outside of vision, the uncomfortable silence between rustling branches. Let the landscape press in on the characters, like paths curve back on themselves, light filters through the trees in strange colors. Even the animals behave as if they know something is wrong. History also matters. Think about what this place has witnessed, what rites were performed here, what stories still echo in the bones of the buildings. Consider the customs that linger, festivals no one can explain, taboos enforced without question, names spoken only in hushed tones. The villagers may not understand the origins of these practices, but they still uphold them, not out of faith, but fear. A great example of this is The Field in England, which shows how a landscape can become disorientating and hostile by bending perception and turning open space into a trap. And in The Ritual, the forest isn't just an obstacle, but a force that invades the mind, reshaping the men who enter it. In both, the land carries intention, it guides, it punishes, and it remembers. The setting in folk horror should feel heavy and closed in, no matter how wide or open it appears. There should be something sacred in the air, something unsettling in the soil. This is a place that doesn't welcome strangers, and once the characters enter, it begins to take notice. So now let's talk about the inhabitants of the setting. So folk horror draws a lot of its power from the tension between the individual and the collective. And the real fear usually lies not in the setting itself, but rather in the people who inhabit it. The community with shared beliefs and customs can feel impenetrable, especially to an outsider who arrives without context. What begins as warmth and hospitality can slowly shift into something more ominous. So the people in folk horror stories should feel unified by something invisible but undeniable. They share a past and all follow the same rituals. They all believe in things that are never bluntly spoken about. Their behavior is polite, even generous, but something about them just feels rehearsed and off. They may give strange looks, their questions may seem innocent but carry a strange weight. And there's a rhythm to their lives that the outsider can't match, and the longer your protagonist stays, the more they feel out of step. Now, every community in folk horror should be built around a central structure of belief. And that structure doesn't need to be explained in full, but it should be felt in everything they do. Consider how they honor seasons, life, and death. Think about their holidays, their taboos, their bedtime stories. They may sing songs sung only at dawn on certain days. Children might be warned to stay indoors when it's a full moon. Visitors may be welcomed with traditional foods, but those offerings come with invisible strings. Basically, tradition holds these people together, but the reason behind their customs has often been forgotten or remembered too well. It really helps to look at real world folklore as a starting point. You can look at fertility rites, ancestor worship, harvest offerings, and solstice celebrations, which all provide rich material. And if you're drawing inspiration from cultural traditions, you want to adjust the details until they become uncanny, shift the symbolism, and distort the purpose. The closer something is to feeling familiar, the more disturbing it becomes when it's just slightly off. Like in Midsummer, the community comes off as being peaceful and enlightened. Their smiles are wide, their rituals are orderly, everything takes place in daylight, but their understanding of grief and death is governed by rules that don't align with modern mortality. And that's what makes them unsettling. They're not being cruel for cruelty's sake because their actions are coming from a belief system that feels logical within their world. They're committed, unwavering, and absolutely certain. The horror comes not from what the group does, but from the knowledge that they see as sacred. There's no room for questioning, no space for doubt, and for the outsider, this becomes a slow descent into helplessness. And for the community, it's simply tradition. And when written well, a folk horror community is not a collective of villains, but rather a single organism. It breathes, it watches, and it waits for the right moment to act. Now let's talk about the protagonist of your story, who is the outsider. What usually happens in their narrative is that they arrive in a place shaped by unfamiliar rules, carrying with them a mindset that doesn't belong. This outsider status places them at odds with their environment, and that friction becomes the engine of the story. To start, you want to establish a logical and believable reason for why your protagonist is entering this setting. They may be a scholar researching forgotten traditions, a tourist who took a detour and ended up somewhere they shouldn't be, or someone returning to claim inherited property with no idea what the land holds. Essentially, their presence must feel intentional on the surface, even if later it reveals itself to be a mistake or a trap. What matters most is that they begin the story with a sense of confidence or control, and that fragile belief will slowly erode as the truth of the place begins to reveal itself. One thing you can do is to give your character flaws, because flaws make the horror personal. You want to create emotional vulnerability the community can recognize and manipulate, like a character who hides behind an obnoxious intellect, a grieving parent desperate for meaning, or someone running from shame or failure. These flaws work because they're cracks where the belief system of the community can begin to seep in. And of course, the protagonist is going to resist at first, but over time, the rituals and customs begin to wear them down. And this tension between who they were and who they're becoming creates the emotional core of the story. This narrative device of transformation is a common outcome in folk horror. It might be physical, psychological, or spiritual. A good example is in The Witch, where we see Thomasin, who is isolated from her family and her faith, being pulled towards something that offers freedom but demands surrender. Or in The Wicker Man, Sergeant Howie is blinded by his hard-headed mortality and fails to see the nature of the world he's walked into until it's far too late. These characters don't just face external threats around them, but they also confront systems that reshape their beliefs, identities, and ultimately their faith. So let your protagonist struggle to maintain their sense of self. Let doubt creep in. Let the customs confuse them as they participate willingly or not in local traditions. Let the rituals unsettle them in subtle ways. And as time passes, they begin to lose their footing. The line between choice and inevitability begins to blur. The place begins to act on them, and it doesn't need to use force. It only needs to wait. Now, rituals are the heartbeat of folk horror because they create structure and legacy. It binds belief to action and gives the story its deepest sense of unease. Every folk horror narrative benefits from a ceremony, a sacrifice, or a sacred act that turns quiet belief into something tangible. And it's this moment that should change the tone of the story. Once the ritual begins, the characters stop speculating and start suffering. As for the ritual itself, the design of it should reflect the core fear at the heart of your story. If your narrative explores the loss of control, you want to use a fertility rite that requires one person to give their body over to the land, and their consent about it is irrelevant. Or if the story is rooted in grief, you can create a harvest ritual where the villagers burn effigies of their dead to ensure crops survive the winter. Let this act carry emotional weight because the horror without meaning feels empty. but ritual grounded in pain becomes unforgettable. And also, we can't forget about symbolism because it matters. You want to use imagery inspired by real folklore, and as I said earlier, you want to alter it so that it feels unfamiliar. Like a harvest god might wear a crown of jawbones, a sacred tree might bleed sap that stains the soil, a birthing ritual could mirror the death of a wild animal and be performed with reverence and terror. You want your visuals to walk a fine line between the beautiful and the horrifying because the reader should be drawn in but repulsed as soon as they look closer. Also, a good ritual should feel unbreakable. Even when the protagonist resists, the community continues on. The songs are sung, the faces are painted, and the instruments are played. The ceremony moves forward with an ancient rhythm that no one can interrupt. And it's this inevitability that creates the dread and a sense of powerlessness. You also want to let the climax of the ritual hit with full force. Whatever tone you've built thus far, lean into it. Silence can be just as creepy as chanting, and sometimes a ritual done in broad daylight with no music and no explanation can be way more unsettling than anything done in the dark. Just keep the vibe consistent all the way through, and by the time it's over, it should feel like something ancient just got what it wanted, and like it always was going to work. So whether you're telling a story of ancient rites deep in the woods or exploring the quiet horrors buried in tradition, remember that folk horror is always about power. It's about the things we inherit, the things we bury on purpose, and the things that rise when the world turns cold and the soil remembers. Writing folk horror means turning to the land, understanding the people shaped by it, and allowing your characters to step willingly into places they were never meant to be. And once they do, the horror doesn't wait, it welcomes them. So that, my friends, was folk horror. If this helped you, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe for more horror writing deep dives like this. I'm Victoria, your speaker of horror. Thank you for joining me in the woods, and remember, the old gods are watching. Until next time, bye-bye.